Welcome to the Igniting Change podcast, brought to you by 3-Sided Cube. This summer, we're releasing a special series of Igniting Change by revisiting some of our most unforgettable episodes. Our fearless co-hosts, Duncan, Sophie, and Puff, will be delving into our archives to hear the journeys of the inspiring individuals harnessing technology to drive incredible social change. So, whether you're a longtime listener or new to our mission, we hope these episodes inspire you to join us in using tech for a force for good. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this special remix of the Igniting Change podcast.
Hello and hi everyone. My name is Amina Hersi. I am the head of the Gender Rights and Justice team with Oxfam International and currently based in the UK, though originally from Kenya, and having a actually very relevant to this topic. Have had to move from my birth country to the UK for safety reasons and for my activism and family activism, actually. So yeah, really happy to be here. What we do in terms of what I mean by gender rights and justice is we really prioritize trying to end all forms of discrimination, violence against women, girls, and non-binary people across the world, and try to address the root causes, including, for example, patriarchy, capitalism, neocolonialism, to end oppression for the most marginalized and historically marginalized people and communities across the world, to alleviate poverty and end injustices.
Can you start by just telling us what we mean when we say sort of shrinking digital spaces, and then what kind of challenges the feminist movement is facing in light of that shrinkage?
No, absolutely. And I think I want to situate this conversation and discussion around the current context that we're experiencing. So maybe to try and articulate what we mean by shrinking civic space, but also digital civic space. Firstly, we are seeing a decrease in relevance of traditional champions of civic space amongst perhaps Western states in the North, donors, multilateral institutions who are no longer seen or recognized as the sole guardians of global norms on civic space. So where before, for example, the UN and human rights declarations were, really propagated centered in the global North, that power, that relevance, that traditional champions of we are the holders of these fundamental human rights has really been watered down, and we are seeing a lot of discrepancies. We're seeing a lot of double standards, and essentially, with the growing trends of illiberal democracies, neoconservative policies, and authoritarian tendencies, several countries are basically diluting and actually restricting and regressing the hard-won gains in terms of the cornerstones of human rights and our foundations on, freedoms of association, assembly, and expression. The second part is because of the polycrises that we're having, we are seeing militarism, being stoked, as we literally are seeing right now, across the world. And that is being, is creating scarcity mindset where there's rationale for deprioritizing basic essential services and rights, but also deprioritizing gender justice and human rights for this aspect of the militarization and security agenda. So I think there's what we mean is essentially because of this, there's a lot of shrinking civic space. People's rights and fundamental freedoms are being restricted. Organizations and third sector, as you call them, stakeholders are more and more being moved to the margins of society, and ultimately we are seeing less engagement and more fighting to actually participate and actively engage to safeguard our rights as we know them. I think with this in mind, just to move on to the second part, in terms of what are the challenges for feminist movements, we are seeing a systemic and systematic assault on feminist movements across the world. We know that, feminist movements and activism has proven to be the most vital and most consistent factor driving progressive policy change towards gender justice. Yet the rising tide in anti-gender and anti-rights movements, who were once on the margins, are becoming well-funded and organized in waging regressive attacks to restore patriarchal order or so-called traditional values and reverse gender justice and human rights advancements across the world. So, we are seeing the state machinery being used to try everything possible in their capacity to curb feminist activism. And
thank you. Yeah, the International Women's Day from the UN, like you said, the theme of invest in women and accelerate change. I think it's amazing because it is kind of a tangible thing. It isn't sort of some inspiring, fluffy, like, yay, let's let's just try harder. It's like, no, we just need some actual money. The funding would be great. I think it's so interesting, everything that you said. I mean, I don't know if this is something that you can kind of contain into one sort of question, but do you know, I mean, sort of listening to everything that you're saying, and I'm sure people listening are sort of thinking the same thing, do we have an idea of why this is happening? Like, why does there feel like there's this sudden fight, like you say, feels like we're having to fight to re-win battles that have been won, things getting overturned? Is there kind of I'm sure there's not one reason.
No, I don't think there's one reason, but I think this increasing trend that we're seeing around like really trying to polarize populist movements are growing more and more. And because of that, what works and the tactics that are being used to basically essentially, create this very polarized society is that we are seeing more and more blatant, leaders who come online and speak to people around things that they know has had historical and, backing in terms of the hard-won fights like that, whether it's civil rights movements or, Stonewall, like there's so much work that has had to be done to name the problem and name the systems of oppression, but also really try to push the system to a point where it recognizes that these are oppressions, and right now through really sophisticated tactics of listening, of trying to change and shift people's social norms to accepting what was once traditional values. Let's go back to the better days, but better days for who, right? And because right now we are living in a very there's a lot of it's a polycrisis from the economy to climate change to people are trying to grasp onto something that perhaps they once knew, right?
It's astonishing. It is when you watch things play out and you see it and you're like, this is like something out of a dystopian novel. How is this happening? This is like Handmaid's Tale in real time.
Exactly. The phrase is crazy.
It is, and the normalization, I'm sure there's a phrase for it, but that thing where you just kind of start accepting, you're like, oh, okay, the overturning of Roe versus Wade, that was
exactly,
absolutely horrendous, but then it felt almost kind of inevitable as soon as it was being talked about. It was like, well, yeah, this is going to happen. I think maybe after a few political events that happened sort of 2016 2018, things that you go, that will never happen, that of course that won't happen, and then they happen. You're like, okay, well, God, maybe there is that scope. And I think it's easy to get stuck in your echo chamber. So I'm surrounded by people who think like me, and so we go, this will never happen, this is terrible, of course they won't overturn Roe versus Wade, and then you read about it in the news and you're like, what the hell? That phrase as well, the traditional values, is so insidious and so horrendous, and you see it a lot in particularly on social media. I've seen it's this huge thing of, and I think, like you say, it's that grasping at the good old days. It's like, oh well, you know, if women weren't so busy doing this, then the climate would probably be better.
Exactly.
Oh, connecting those two things, man. Like,
but also,
that's not how that works.
Exactly, and also how it's actually moving and being replicated from different, you know, jurisdictions, different states. You would never imagine that what is happening in Africa is happening in Europe and is happening in Asia. Exact same tactics, you know, being employed, and because it's worked, we are actually seeing more funding for the anti-rights, anti-gender forces, and as we say, like the criminalization and deprioritization of gender rights, but also of human rights in general. So it's a very worrying time, actually, for all of us.
It must be a tough time to be in your space. I mean, I think, you know, the thing that you mentioned earlier about the backsliding, I think that is, like you say, one of the biggest worries, just because, you know, you think it's hard enough. We're still trying to get to that place of equality. It already feels like a big enough task. To be backsliding, to be regressing is just really, really tough and really demotivating. And I think, you know, it's really important to stay motivated, of course, because we can't just accept it. But yeah, I can imagine it must be really tough. And especially when it's, like you say, it's not even just kind of that backsliding in policy. It's the physical threats of violence. So it's like, it's not just, oh, this might not get through. It's, I might die if I just speak on behalf of women and vulnerable people, and you know, my family might be affected, and you know, like you say, you've sort of experienced that, having to move firsthand, and just for speaking out for women. And I think that's, I mean, it's just absolutely horrendous, like you say, really, really tough time. And you would think in this time where there is so much going on, like you say, the sort of poly crisis, you kind of would have loved to see everyone pull together and be like, all right, let's just park the gender, let's just, you know, let's all work together on these big things around the climate and all the rest of it, just to try and make that better, not just double down on the gender rights. That sucks. What kind of solutions can we kind of talk about in terms of creating the positive spaces? Come on, you need to build us back up.
We do. And our one call is always to fund change for a feminist future. We truly, really include this in all our call to actions, because I think re-envisioning a bold world where our rights are respected, we can live with dignity and safe from all forms of violence is something worth holding on to in all ways. In terms of, for me, I think civic space and restrictions and patriarchy go hand in hand, and you just touched upon this a little bit. I think we are seeing it disproportionately affecting women, especially from historically oppressed backgrounds in the global south. And we can counter this by creating safe, diverse, active, civic space. We want a space where feminist movements can thrive, that allows for their equal, safe, and meaningful participation at all levels, whether it's in the home or, you know, in the streets or in decision-making spaces. Having the meaningful participation, I think, is the most important thing. I would break it down a little bit in terms of, one, governments and major funders need to make a political choice. They have to have the political will to fund and support gender justice. We always put our money where we think is most important. And so far, we have seen that gender justice is not a priority because of how little funded it is. And this is across the board. So I think that would, you know, really, we are tired of the rhetoric. We're tired of commitments, start implementing, put put your money where your mouth is.
Put your money where your mouth is, 100%. So what we talked earlier about the UN's theme for this year. So for International Women's Day, so it's invest in women and accelerate progress. So how does funding and financing play a role in this positive space?
Funding and financing ensures the long-term sustainability of all the efforts that I say me because we, I consider myself as part of the feminist movement. So
Great,
I'm going to keep saying we.
Yeah, definitely, please do.
That we need, right? So, and the kinds of areas that we have identified that really needs our effort and our space to make a difference and to make a change. When we advocate for funding, we're not asking just for mere cash, and I think you were just touching upon this earlier. We're asking for resources that enable us to break the chains of our current financial systems. So it's not charity. It's not like give us grants to do some activities. Like that's not essentially what we're asking for. Money, the money accumulated by governments, by corporations and billionaires has been taken from the backs of women, girls and gender diverse and non-binary people. And it is, exploiting their labor and productivity to keep them in low paid and precarious jobs with no access to resources.
And in terms of sort of what people who are listening can do, so talking about that sort of activism and the grassroots organisations, so what can be done to kind of achieve that meaningful representation and achieve the gender justice that we want so badly?
I love this question because I'll give one of my favourite quotes is by June Jordan, which I think rings true today as it did when she wrote it. She says, "I've always had to invent the power my freedom requires."
Very nice.
And I think it's such a powerful representation of grassroots and local feminist queer organizations. Some of the biggest and systemic changes we've achieved have been by grassroots movements, and that, gender justice is no exception, be it historically from, the fight of women's rights to vote, or, the rise of Black feminists who fought for, against racist establishments, whether it's in the US or colonial eras in Africa. It's been an ongoing organization and organizing of their struggles and fighting for their freedom and having the power within to basically show up and demand, their rights. So they've been at the forefront of change collectively and building power. Their role is crucial and will always be crucial. In fact, just an example of Kenya, where I'm from, we have about 1,000 local grassroots organizations currently who are organizing against the increase of femicides in Kenya and using, the hashtag of #ShutDownKE. They've mobilized nationwide, marches across and demanding that femicide be recognized as a national emergency and that actually the government embeds, key policies and investment in ending this. So it's really important to start thinking about what that means, and also, am I the right person to be in this space? Should I be the one speaking for X people, or do I know somebody who actually would be better suited? So it's really about also checking our egos, checking our power and privileges, and creating that space, and really just, I think if you're self-aware as well and want positive change and like long-lasting sustainable change, I think that's the problem. We need more people who want that, or at least at the power level areas. And then we get to see activists do what they do. Feminist organizations continue to fight with or without being given the space, or they're creating the power that their freedom requires in every day, and they will continue to do that. So I'm not worried about that. Actually, that's one of the things that really keeps me going and keeps me
Yeah.
hopeful, and one of the main reasons that I always commemorate, I think, International Women's Day, is that it's a reminder of women's struggles for centuries. And I know that I am stepping on, the shoulders of other feminists and queer people who have fought for me to be able to speak about these issues. And it's phenomenal. And yeah, so I think just providing the space for them to do that would be fantastic.
Amazing. Thank you. That was so insightful and so important, I think, to, like you say, sort of look at it with a bit of depth and sort of say, like, how can I support in the best way, rather than just kind of shouting the loudest or saying I'm an ally. It's like, okay, that making space, I think, is really important, because obviously there's all the layers and the intersections, and so it isn't just as straightforward as being like, I'm a feminist. You have to take all of the other bits into account as well.
It's so great to be here. My name is Bernard Kovacs. I'm the head of the World Food Program's Innovation Accelerator globally. So what we're doing, we're identifying startups and nonprofits that can help disrupt global hunger, but also other sustainable development goals by now.
Amazing. So thank you so much for coming and talking to us today. So we are huge fans of what you guys do. I think, obviously, which I'm sure you get all the time, everyone kind of looks at what you do and thinks it's pretty amazing. I just wanted to kind of start with a bit about you personally, if that's okay, and just kind of your journey, how you got started. So you, on your LinkedIn, I've done a bit of stalking. So prior to working at the UN, you were at Boston Consultancy, kind of doing new business opportunity stuff. So how did you get into that, and how did that then lead to the UN?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I guess, I studied I have 3 master's degrees that are business related. So that's where, maybe not the most clearest pathway to what I'm doing right now. But so I started my career working for the Boston Consulting Group, and essentially I was building lots of businesses for large scale corporates, like tech companies, industrial goods companies, consumer companies. And I was always fascinated by social impact, and I wanted to actually find out how can I contribute. And it took me a while, and then I realized came across the World Food Program. And it's wow, what the World Food Program does, this is very business related, delivering food for people in emergencies, but also sustainably ending hunger, connecting farmers to markets, and so on and so forth. So these are definitely the types of opportunities. And so I actually was looking for social impact opportunities, and then I went to the World Food Program and built up the internal management consulting team. And then, based on that, the journey continued.
Yeah, nice. I love how you casually just threw in there that you have 3 master's degrees. That's a lot. Okay, and then so 2015 you started the Accelerator. So can you talk a bit about that, what the problem was, how that came about? Because it's pretty impressive stuff when you read about it.
Yeah, no, I think the key point for me actually was that when I was working at the World Food Program, in the internal management consulting team, we did a lot of projects related to business process improvement, also optimizing supply chain, different aspects of the transformation program of the incoming CEO, the executive director, as we called it. And then at some point I realized, well, it only costs $80 to feed a child for a day. Let's assume a lot of people don't know this. And I honestly was shocked at the time when I found out. It's it's so little money comparably to a lot of other things you spend money on. If more people know this, why, imagine you have a button on your phone that you press, and then why wouldn't a lot of young people actually donate? Because 80 cents, yes, maybe it's not, you don't donate every day, but let's assume we're having a coffee or a tea together, or then why wouldn't we also want to share our meal with a child in need? So that's how actually with a friend together we founded an app called Share the Meal. And when we did that, I actually realized, so some of the things that we were doing were really hard because there weren't that many social impact startup accelerators out there. And this is how this idea about having an innovation accelerator for the World Food Program and the broader SDGs came about. Say, there must be so many more founders, entrepreneurs, startups out there. They all have great ideas, but they never get the support that they need to really be successful and scale. And that's how we then in 2015, I was able to start the World Food Programme's Innovation Accelerator, also get support from initially it was the German and Bavarian governments. By now we are running a total of 16 social impact accelerator programs for the World Food Programme, but also for other UN entities, for different governments, for different NGOs, foundations, on topics like climate action, gender equality, education, vaccine delivery, like humanitarian assistance, you name it. And I think this is one of the aspects of, I'm a true believer that we need more innovation, we need more startups, more technology solutions to make a big difference for tackling some of the biggest problems that we're facing as a world right now. It's not going to solve everything, but I think that's definitely where we'll find some big impact actually.
Yeah, definitely. I, again, hugely agree with that. And I've watched your TED talk and enjoyed it very much about how we need to change our mindset. But going back to the original sort of thing with the Share the Meal, which is obviously incredibly successful, App of the Year in 2020. And I, again, had a look at some of the kind of stats that you have around that. And can you tell us a bit about the impact sort of today around it?
Yeah, no, Share the Meal. And this is where if you're, I don't know, anybody who's listening to this, an app, everybody can download it. It's on your iPhone or also an Android phone. And Share the Meal works really simple. It's an app on your phone. Yeah, you can press a button, and by just one tap, you essentially share your meal. You can choose do you want to donate $80 cents or more, or if it's pounds or US dollar or euros, it's different amounts of money, but it's an equivalent of that. And then you can actually choose where you want to share your meal with for whether it's supporting people fleeing inside Gaza, whether it's supporting the emergency in Afghanistan right now, or also helping families in need affected by floods, or also climate action. So that you can actually choose which geography and what type of solution you're interested in, and you can invite your friends. And what's exciting is that so far there's over 195 million shared meals. So it's over $130 million. And because sometimes that's the question of well, what if I gave 80 cents, how much impact can I have? Well, the 80 cents alone, that does not make the difference, but together we can actually make a big difference.
Yeah, that's absolutely incredible. Why do you think the app was so successful? What do you think the secret sauce is, if you like?
I think in the first place, a lot of people actually do care about problems and they want to share. And but I think there's also specifically with younger people, if you're a mobile first user, you probably want to know and you want to have a choice what you donate to, right? So it's not just that I'm writing a huge check and then I don't want to hear from it or about what's actually happening with the money anymore. The app actually gives you feedback, what you've donated for, how much money has been raised. You actually see a story that's from actual people that receive funds through the World Food Programme as United Nations agency. And I think this is part of the aspect what has made it so successful here. And it's also looking into the basic mindset behind it, because a lot of times charities or NGOs will work with negative campaigning. Personally, so Sebastian, my co-founder, and I at the time, just from an ethical, moral perspective, we did not want to do this. And I think it's also not the right thing to do. Is we wanted to show children that already had received support, and therefore you're not seeing children that are still starving, because honestly I don't think that's something that you should be doing. And it seems to be resonating with a lot of people, because showing that you can make a difference.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think as well people have, because I know there was a big sort of rush of that style of marketing across a lot of NGOs where it was kind of very controversial and everything, but I think people are so not immune to it, but kind of they've seen so much of it now that it has lost some of its impact. And like you say, there's something that doesn't feel quite right with it, kind of ethically. But I think as well, we've had a look at it. We actually when we were recently interviewing for product owners, we actually got them to have a look at the Share the Meal app and kind of talk to us about it and do a deep dive on it and talk about why they thought it was so successful and stuff. So it's interesting. But some of the stuff they came back with was, it's just so simple. It's so simple to use. The call to action is so clear in terms of what you need to do and what the impact will be. I think as well, because it's not subscription and it's not repeat donation, and you can kind of have that control, and it's that one-off thing. Like you say, it's, 80 cents is, isn't a huge amount. It doesn't feel like a major commitment, and on its own might not have that massive impact, but when combined with everyone else, it can have a huge impact for people. So yeah, I think it's absolutely incredible.
Thank you.
What a success story.
No, and people can donate more. Of course, they can also subscribe by now. But like, at least the original idea was not it was really meant to be like making sure that even if you care and you share your meal, like then you can make a difference.
So in terms of the Accelerator and the various programs that you're running, can you talk to me a bit about how you choose what to do? Because you must get inundated with people's ideas and technology that they're using. Like, how on earth do you make those choices?
So we are a firm believer in open innovation, so everybody can apply. So our website, it's innovation.wfp.org. There's a button that says like apply now, and everybody can apply as long as you do need to have a legal entity. And so what we do is typically we do this 2 times per year now. When we just have a call for applications with a cutoff date. And before doing that, we typically identify priority areas for World Food Programme, like from a policy level, but also on the ground where our colleagues are. So World Food Programme is 100% voluntarily funded. So it's like funded by donations only. But we have right now over 22,000 staff in 120 countries and territories. So like they are the ones that are working with the government, with the local communities, with serving people that are hungry or, smaller farmers, right? And so step 1 is essentially to identify like what are those problem areas. But there's always also a wild card, and then people can apply. We also actively search for startups or innovations. Okay. And then what we do typically is then looking in these priority areas to say, okay, out of between 700 to over 1,000 applications that are inbound, we select the 8 to 10 best. Now, that is challenging. Like, it's like just to say, like, I mean, I wish we could support more, but it's like it's also for us. It's based on available funding. If we could support more, if we had more funding, yeah. But like so far, I think part of the like what we're looking for in startups is like also like what's the impact potential? How innovative is it? How strong is the team? Does it fit our strategy? Is this a sustainable business model? So it could be both for-profit or non-profit. And then are we the right partners for them? Because sometimes it could be great startup, but we really can't help them other than just giving them cash. So like this is where like also maybe we're not the right partner.
Yeah. I can imagine that is a hell of a process to go through, because it must be, I mean, I'm sure you get some rogue applicants that must be quite entertaining, but I imagine the most part it's that everyone's trying to do something good, right? So being able
absolutely.
to make that
And also just to say, like, I think a lot of like, sometimes the wildcard applications are the best because, they're not deterred and have something really amazing. So like,
I can fully imagine there are some very interesting ones in there. But
I don't know, you probably recall like the Turkey earthquake. There was a vast area that actually was affected by it. And so like looking at satellite images for that, I mean, that would have taken a long period of time.
Weeks and weeks, and presumably lots of people power and lots of kind of efforts around that. It's it reminds me of something. I was talking to someone from UNHCR on the podcast recently, and they were talking about, and I don't know if this is similar how you guys get the footage, but they were talking about how they're using drones to capture imagery in refugee camps to understand where there are needs for things like street lamps and kind of other resources, and then they're getting people from the camps to then feed the model to say like, this is a street lamp, this is a blanket, whatever. So again, that kind of ecosystem, and it's making them much more efficient in terms of how they distribute their resources. So it sounds like it's a similar
yeah. We've actually looked into different aspects of like, so also like using drones and AI, like the or also like different types of like satellite imagery and like sensors that you can use. Now the challenge sometimes is like, what's the area that you can cover? Like some satellites, like depending on the resolution, you can cover a bigger area, but then also the satellite actually has to pass over that area. So you have the big images, so like, which is an issue, right? Now for the drones, again, you need somebody to be on the ground and actually fly the drone, right?
Yeah.
And the other aspect is like, do you have the computing power then locally, or is it international? There's some trade-offs that you have to do with these types of solutions, but I think actually the solution sometimes can be that you're actually using different data sources and overlay them. So like, sometimes it might be in-person surveys that you're doing on the ground. Sometimes it might be technology-based.
Yeah, so I guess it's kind of the right tool for the job. But that efficiency to take something from 2 weeks to 48 hours, that must have an incredible impact. And I think is that difficult to measure? I think something we've come across when we talk to people at various NGOs is actually measuring impact. Sometimes you can say, we've raised this much money and that's okay, but the actual impact of, okay, so what does that mean that you've got it from 2 weeks to 48 hours? What does that mean?
Yeah, no, and like this, and this is where like it's the challenge sometimes is like, what is the sometimes hard to prove, like, okay, like we did this, what would have happened if we hadn't had the information?
Yeah.
And like this is something a bit of a theoretical exercise, but like we're trying as much as we can to capture this on project level, and at the same time we look into like a proxy for like, do innovations work, do innovations scale, typically in terms of how many people are positively impacted and how much money did they raise. So like our total portfolio of innovations last year, so by the end of 2022, positively impacted about 37 million people, and they've raised a total of $200 million of grant funding, and so not counting equity investments.
Yeah, and it is that impact thing, like how do we measure if it's actually helping people? And I think as well I presume same for you, when it's funded by donor dollars, there's that additional kind of, pressure, I guess. Obviously when it's, all money is important and it's important that it's well spent, but when it is coming from donors, I think that adds an extra layer of pressure to get it right. But so, I mean, it's obviously your process of choosing them is pretty affected by some of the results that you've had, so that's incredible.
I mean, this is where like a lot of I guess specifically for governments, like I'll have to give a lot of kudos. Like, I mean, when we started to like the German and Bavarian government to actually be the first ones to trust and say like, well, we believe that, using human-centered design, lean startup thinking, that an accelerator, we can de-risk some of these risky innovations. But it's, at the same time is like, sometimes it is also about the process of like, and I'm usually trying to explain this, like, using human-centered design, lean startup process, you're essentially saving money by not wasting it. So like you might spend like $2 million on a great project that you have planned, prepared, and then implement. But because you do like that in a sequential stage and you never co-develop with the people that it's intended for, you actually waste a lot of money. But of course, that's not what people usually want to hear. But like the other aspect I have to say is, if you're working on real innovation, it's not like you can actually just like I'm doing a desk research on what's the best mode, because in a lot of cases where we're working is like, we're literally faced with a situation where this has never been done before, or this has never been done before in that particular context. And I think that's something we just have to be acutely aware.
Yeah, it's that risk management thing, isn't it? Like you say, it's, if you're right at the edge of the innovation and you spend $100,000 and it doesn't work, that's better than committing $2 million and finding out 2 years later that it's not going to work. So kind of taking that approach to, like you said, the sort of the lean kind of startup approach is amazing. The other one that I think you mentioned was is it Impact? Am I saying that right? Impact, the digital skills training program. Can you talk a bit about that? Just because I found that amazing. So.
No, again, this is going to talk about like, so the people we serve as World Food Program oftentimes are the most vulnerable people that you can imagine. So like people who have been like fleeing or displaced within a country, people who are refugees in a different country, or young people that never were able to get basic education because their families were too poor. And I think this is where in a particularly when people are fleeing, like a lot of times also employment opportunities are scarce. So like you might be able to become a carpenter or like actually do a different job, but then there's only so many carpenters that you need in a particular area. Now, this is where essentially the idea of impact came about, where it's like, okay, why don't we connect young people to essentially like online work, freelance work, like to the future of jobs. And the beauty of that is like it's not location dependent. And so this started first with like Syrian refugees in Lebanon and vulnerable Lebanese people to say, and this has gone into different countries, like in Kenya, in Iraq, where we're essentially working with them to, in the basic training, we provide training to do like micro freelance work, which is like data cleaning, picture annotation, like things you still need to do to train AI processes actually right now. And then in advanced training, then people become like social media manager, website designer, and then the freelance online. And for me, this is, I think, one of the best models to actually prove why technology can make a difference, because it doesn't matter where you sit on the planet, you can still at work. You can be a single mom sitting at home and still work with your, maybe with your phone, maybe with your computer that you're having, and actually earn money online that you might not be able to do otherwise. And so impact, I mean, there's right now over 20,000 graduates of the program in several countries, and sometimes people can earn like $10 per hour or even more. Like and those are people that before were dependent on donations and food from the World Food Program.
Yeah, so, which is incredible, right? Giving them that kind of independence and the ability to earn the money and the skills that will take them, into further jobs, and kind of stops them from being left behind in terms of sort of keeping up with the technology. And I think there was a stat on there as well, the graduates that you'd had, it was 54% were female, which is also amazing, kind of making that conscious effort to kind of train up the kind of female contingent. When you talk about kind of AI and sort of the new technology and all the rest of it, something that does come up is kind of the ethics around it and the access and how you kind of mitigate that. So I'm sure, obviously working for such a wonderful organisation, there is a lot of thought that goes into that and governance and things. Can you talk a bit around the ethics and kind of that side of things and how you manage that?
So funnily enough, like in the World Food Program, like we've also created a responsible AI task force, like with different stakeholders from across the organization. Now, we have been actually working on this for quite a while, and I think the impetus like has to be not only about like the use of AI, but also like how to make the technology useful and used, but also accessible to people. And like I think this is something that, as the world, like I mean, in most countries, we actually have to ask ourselves this: is like, okay, it's one thing to actually like have access to technology, but who actually knows what is happening here, and like who can make an informed choice, and then you very very quickly get to from like, okay, there's only so many places in the world and only so many companies in the world that actually work on like the future of AI. Is that problematic? How can we work so that representatives or like people who are actually working in like governments actually know what they're what laws they make, what regulations they're making or lack thereof, and then this question becomes a lot more challenging when you're talking about like countries that are right now maybe not as having as much exposure to technology or as many choices or as much available capital. And it's even when you look at AI, there is an aspect, and like this is as much, I would say, like there's opportunities and there's risks, and you have to have a balanced view about both of them. I personally do believe like there is an opportunity to work and leverage technology for good, but you also need to be aware. You need knowledgeable people to actually assess this, so they can't be just blindly trusting whatever people are telling you.
Yeah, I think that sort of self-awareness and having the dedicated people looking at it is really key. Having a task force, which sounds very cool, is really important to make sure that it is being monitored, because I think the technology is moving faster than the policy and the laws and everything possibly can. So I think having people who are there looking out for it to look at the possible outcomes, and you can have the best intention, but if the technology gets out and it's not quite right, or the models that are being fed by people that all look the same or whatever, then that's not going to be kind of helpful. So
I do hope we'll see more convergence of essentially ESG, sustainability investing and impact investing, and getting the UN nonprofits into technology. And I think as much as as World Food Programme and different other organizations, we're now leveraging technology, innovations, and startups, and bringing this kind of business mindset into those organizations. Sometimes it has been there before, but making it when you're talking about which organizations are on the leading end in terms of innovation, I hope it's also some of those organizations that tackle big problems that will be on the leading end, for using innovations, and similarly that the organizations like the ones that control the capital, the technology, that they do even more in terms of using the technology for good. And as I was saying earlier, I think both in terms of what we're seeing with right now hunger numbers, but also climate change, we need to take action right now.
So my name is Isabel Widmer. I am a physician, among other things. So I studied medicine, and when I was studying medicine years ago, I remember telling my cousin I want to go and work with populations that haven't got enough doctors. And he was a sort of a somewhat cynical already physician, and he said, "Oh, everybody wants to do that when they're studying," and that I never ended up doing that, but that desire to help people and to export medical knowledge to populations that really need it stayed with me. So over the course of my career, I studied medicine, worked in research for many years in the US as well. Then I joined the pharmaceutical industry. And since 2013, I've been consulting. And in the course of my consulting work, I was mentoring this charity, the Virtual Doctors. And they'd come to Basel to take part in a competition, really, for startups or for health tech startups that need support. And this is run by Basel City. And so the organizers bring on board mentors to work with these people for a day to focus on the topics they have. And the topic that we were discussing at the time was, how can we expand the service? And so you're allowed to pick who you want to work with. And I thought, this is fantastic. I finally get to do something that I've always wanted to do, and to work with this charity for this day. And during that day, it's fabulous because you pull in all the attendees of this meeting. So it's pharma companies, lots of different people who will then work with you in a workshop setting on the problem. And at the end of that, James, who is now our CEO, said, would you think you might be interested in being on our board? And I said, would love that. That would be so fantastic. And I think about 2 years later, I joined their board. So that was fantastic for me, because it's something that I'm not using my practical medical expertise in that way, but I am bringing my other knowledge and I'm a doctor, but I'm also a data junkie. That's probably a bad thing to say. I'm a data nerd. I like data. I like it a lot, and I like the power it has for populations, for any decision-making process.
Virtual Doctors is an amazing organization.
Yes.
Tell us a bit more about them and what they do.
It's a fantastic organization. I think there's so much that is truly impressive about them. And I think I had the two reasons. One, I was asked to join the board, and the other is I talked to the founder, Hugh Jones. I think you may not have met Hugh. And Hugh has this wonderful video where he tells the story of the history of the organization. And I still watch that, and it still gives me goosebumps, because he tells the story of he started working in various countries in Africa, I think in 1988, as a safari guide. And I actually spoke to him yesterday. I said, tell me, what is it that made you want to found the charity? And he said, well, I was there from 1988 onwards, and always in rural areas in Zambia, Malawi, sometimes South Africa. And frequently I would see people dying. There's a lot of mortality, morbidity from illnesses that would be easily treatable, but there was no access to healthcare. And he said, it touched me deeply because these were people I knew, or they were people I knew of. So I was part of that community, and it was hard to see that people are dying even though the diseases are treatable. And so that was something he lived with for a while as he was there. And he was there up until, he was there for a long time. And then he told me that I think it was 19, I don't know, was it 89 or 99? I've forgotten. But it was one year, he said he witnessed two situations that sort of were the catalyst for him to found the charity. And the one story that's really stayed with me is he was driving through the bush, and he saw some blood on the tracks, in the dusty tracks, and he thought, we're close to a national park, so maybe an animal has, a cheetah or a lion has attacked an animal, and there's blood on the road. And so he says he followed this track for 2 or 3 kilometers, and he came upon a man cycling in the heat with his wife on the handlebars, and she was resting against him. And he said, and I saw that was where the blood was coming from. She was very pregnant and she was bleeding. And the man told him, I tried to take her to the hospital that's local. We don't have a hospital. We have a clinical officer who's a healthcare professional, but he's not a physician. And my wife needed something more. And the next hospital was 100 kilometers away, so 60 miles. And he describes this as he said it was November, the rains were coming, it was very humid. So just imagining being on a bicycle on a dusty track with your pregnant wife driving to the hospital, it's very touching to think about that. I mean, how that man must have felt. And Hugh then tried to help. He put the woman, they said, we put her in the back of my pickup truck. That was the best I could do. The man came with me in the car and we drove. And he said, as we drove, she quietly died in the back of my car.
Wow.
And he said, and that was the moment. He said, that was the moment where I knew I have to do something. And he said, but what can I do? I'm a safari guide. I'm not a doctor. I have no access. I'm not a millionaire. So I don't really have any power. But the idea didn't leave him. I think that to me is what speaks to me so much about this charity. It's sort of, it speaks to the effort of one human being who is in some ways, just Hugh Jones, nobody special, but he cared enough to make a difference. And he cared enough to keep that idea in his mind. And he started talking to people in Zambia and said, look, to doctors. He had a lot of doctor friends, but they were all in the main cities. And so he said, they're too far away to make a difference. They were willing to help for free, but he said, okay, that wasn't going to work. And in 2001, then he'd finished his master's and the idea was still with him. So he said, right, now I have some savings, and the Ministry of Health had given him the go ahead to start a pilot. So that was the first app that was built, was volunteer built. And I think that to me, that was also really nice because it's such a grassroots type of effort, right? There's some man in the bush, and then he has wonderful charisma, does Hugh. So he's very good at bringing people on board. And so he was able to grow something because of that strong belief he had. And then we had the app, and that was where we were up until not that very long ago.
I think it's fascinating how we glamorize founders that start businesses. Mm-hmm. We don't glamorize founders that start charities, and the effort that you need, determination that you need to do that is just exponentially more than it is to start, a startup or a business. You very rarely talk about these type of founders, but it's incredibly, it does blow my mind. I mean, I've started a business, but to start a charity from scratch with an idea, and maybe like you said with Hugh, he's not in that field. How does he start off? Where does he get funding from? How does he, get people to buy into the idea? And he's breaking new ground. In terms of, does it actually work? Does it, can we get the technology to work? I think it's incredible.
In 2001. I think I had my first email account in 1999, but it was very early on.
Yeah.
And so thinking of doing a telemedicine service with doctors abroad serving Africa, African countries back then was actually quite revolutionary. Nowadays, you think it's nothing special, but back then, for somebody who's neither a tech expert nor linked into that, nor a doctor, but just somebody who really cared, I found that quite inspiring. He didn't just say, well, I'd love to do this, but I can't. He said, right, something has to be done. There's just me, and I'm going to make something happen. And I do find that very inspiring.
Yeah, hugely. And we were all still on dial-up in 2001, right? That dial-up was
remember
the only way.
Little diddly, yes.
Yeah. So communication was very slow, right? You'd be lucky if you get an image, you'd get some text backwards and forwards. Yeah, you'd get the lovely noise.
I actually quite like that noise.
I do as well.
It's
a good throwback for sure.
So what we do is we support clinical officers who work in rural Africa, and it's probably hard to imagine for somebody who hasn't been there. We've seen photographs. So this clinical officer would be somebody with maybe 2 years of clinical experience. It's not a doctor. And that person is managing a whole population of individuals who are very far away from the nearest hospital. The nearest hospital is usually about 100 kilometers, 60 miles away. And there are sometimes ambulances, but usually a patient needs to pay to get themselves to a hospital or cycle. And I was talking to our CEO, who reminded me that many of the patients, when they're female, don't want to go because they've got small children or they have crops. And so even if they are very sick, it costs a lot. They have to pay themselves. They have to pay in the hospital. They have to take their family members with them to look after them. And so people, even if they could, they generally try not to go because they have so much to do. So the goal of the charity really is to provide a telemedicine service, and that is via the app that I'll talk about in a minute, what yours will do, or what we're going to do together actually to improve the situation. So currently we have the app we used to use that was built by volunteers, and that enables a clinical officer to write a clinical question into the app that is then sent to a volunteer doctor. The first one was in New York, the first one ever for the virtual doctors was in New York, funnily enough, but now they're all NHS volunteers. And they, in their free time, they will answer a question that takes them maybe 20 minutes. And so it's not an immediate response, but within 24 hours, a clinical officer will get a response to a question. And the ultimate goal really is, on the one hand, to try and avoid referrals to hospitals, to ensure that patients get better care, and to really increase educational levels as well. So to support people to grow where they are. And because of what we do, they have access to specialists, which they wouldn't necessarily have in their own countries. And I think it's also very important actually here to say that the clinical officers work rurally, and they are tied into a district where there is a clinician, or there are clinicians in the hospitals that will be accessible for them, but those clinicians are also running the hospitals and doing a lot of the administrative stuff, so the managing. So there's not really enough resources for them to tie into, even if there is the knowledge locally. So that's why our service sort of supports that and buffers it. And I think it's something we forget frequently, that there's not enough doctors worldwide already. There's not enough healthcare professionals. And so there's not enough in Africa either. So that's the background. And our challenge with our old app was that it wasn't scalable, it was clunky, and it wasn't fit for purpose. And so we've been looking for a long time on how to build something professional. And of course, with the volunteers, it's not possible. So we were very excited when we found you, and found you with your, I think, passion for the topic. That was something that came very strong, through very strongly. We spoke to Gabby right there. The excitement to do something that is going to help people. And so what our change now is with your app, It's going to enable us to do things that we were never able to do before. It's going to enable us to answer questions faster, I hope. It's going to enable us to transfer data more in a better way. But also we're going to be able to analyze what we do. And that wasn't possible before. So before we had to export things into a CSV file and it wasn't possible to analyze any of the data. Now we'll be able to see who's answered, how have they answered, has the question been answered well or not, are there open questions? And it's making us scalable too, because before we were supported only by volunteers, and now we're going to have a full-scale professional app to support clinical officers. So it's very exciting. I think we're very, very excited to see how that's going to be. I think you make an excellent point I didn't think of. You're right. We have benefited by having something in place that wasn't perfect, right? And I think there's a couple of benefits. One, we had a system out, so it's been socialized. People already use a system. Often people that I work with, I do a lot of system rollouts, and people sort of go, but I like my old system. I don't want a new system, right? I know where the button was. And I totally relate to that, because when I'm using Windows and every 5 days there's an update and suddenly things move around, or Excel moves stuff around all the time. And you think, but I just knew how to do it, and now I have to think again. It's really frustrating. But for us now, we've had a system that worked. I mean, it was fit for purpose-ish, but it wasn't having something now where one of the things I love about the system that we're going to have now with you is the fact that it's going to be, I always get customizable and configurable wrong. I know I shouldn't, but I do. So that we've got the back end where if we suddenly need to say we want to pick up infectious diseases that are, I don't know, another pandemic, for example, where we're hearing people putting it, we try and keep the system pretty simple. So what we're typing in is very basic, but then we could add a field easily to say, was this an infectious disease? And that will enable us to suddenly pick up signals in a customized way when we need it, rather than having too much in the system. So it's not too heavy, I think, right now. I mean, I haven't seen what it looks like at the moment, but it's fit for purpose and quite streamlined, so people will be able to fill it in the time that they can with 50 people waiting outside. And so it's reasonable, but it's also flexible enough to adapt to what we might need in the future. And I think to me, that's very exciting. And the other bit that's very exciting is, as you said, we've had years of experience, but now people on the ground have also had years of experience using the clunky ones. So now something, downloadable, functional, modern is coming along.
Yeah.
I think that's really very cool, because we're showing growth, but also we're giving them something better. I mean, a lot better.
Yeah.
And lastly, of course, if we do, the goal ultimately is to work with countries to make them independent of us. So at that point, you need to have something that you can say, here's an app. You're now free to work independently of us with help from us if you need it. But if it's volunteer driven, you can never actually get to that next stage where you can say, we've now built the system, implemented it, supported, trained, and now we want to not set you free, but give you the freedom to work how you'd like to independently, so that we can go and work with other countries. And that wasn't possible before, and now it will be. So I think that's really very exciting. And because
it's very interesting when you start looking at the data, just understanding like the questions, what doesn't get answered.
Yeah.
It will open up, I think, a world of, as you scale,
Yep.
and that's probably an interesting one to talk about. You do need to understand that, right? You're going through an optimization process. How can you reach as many people as possible? And that is a process of like eliminating steps or optimizing steps. And the only way you can do that is through the data that you're gonna that you'll see. That's really interesting. So
there is the caveat. I'm going to sound very cynical and negative here, but I do have many conversations, and it's a bit like, I don't know, it's a bit like having the Wizard of Oz or Mary Poppins, right? I sometimes talk to people about data analytics, and they say, can't we just put artificial intelligence on top of this? And I'm like, do you ever call Mary Poppins to clean up your 3-year-old's room? Does it work? I mean, I know I have that desire too. I don't have a 3-year-old, but I do have that wouldn't it be wonderful if I could just call the universe and poof, this would all go away? It would be fantastic.
I think I mean, we're definitely we get the whole curve in terms of the hype curve with all new technology and AI can do a huge amount, and undoubtedly will do a massive amount. But our expectations of what it can do versus what it can actually do in certain scenarios is that gap is reasonably sizable. But there's no doubt it's going to be the underlying. But data is going to be the key to that, right? That is, having the right data, access to the right data, so it can ingest it, understand it. Understand the needs. That is definitely going to be the key. But I'm sure virtual doctors will be using AI at some point. Right? There's no doubt about it.
Well, absolutely. I think that the potential and the promise is huge, but I think it ends up being what you said before, right? It's you still have to think. You have to think about. And this is the same thing for us with the data analytics. What am I capturing? Because you can capture everything, but we both know that doesn't necessarily add any value.
Obviously, people can check out Virtual Doctor's website. Is there any way that they can help, or is there anything else that people can do if they hear the story and are interested?
Well, I think that one of the things probably helps most if they have a look at some of the YouTube videos, because we've got video that. I think that's where the story starts, where you think I'd like to be engaged. So you have a look at that. On the website, there are a couple of calls to action. There's, of course, various ways. There's donations, but there's also the opportunity to help us with marketing activities if somebody's expert at that. So there's a lot of different ways of getting involved: writing copy, working with the team, being a doctor, being a volunteer, being a physiotherapist, anything really. I think if it speaks to somebody who's listened to this, then they can find a way to be involved if that's something that interests them.